It was the silence afterward that hurt more than the shouting ever could. I didn't cry when I left. I didn't scream, beg, or even slam the door. I just walked. The suitcase dragged behind me like an unwanted pet, squeaking across the sidewalk as I passed the neighbors' tidy yards, careful not to make eye contact. It was spring, but the air still held a bite, like winter hadn't quite let go yet. I ended up at the bus depot, a squat brick building with two flickering lights and a soda machine that ate your quarters. I spent what little I had on a one-way ticket to Madison, Indiana, a town I remembered only from postcards Grandma Hattie used to send me when she'd visit her sister there. I figured I'd find a job, any job, and figure it out from there. By the time the bus pulled in, the sun had dipped behind the old grain silos on the edge of town, and my stomach growled with a kind of desperation I hadn't felt in years. I had $37 left. I used 12 of it on a cheap motel room that smelled like bleach and cigarette ash, and fell asleep, fully dressed, my arms wrapped around my sketchbook like it was the only thing still mine. The next morning I walked, past shuttered shops, faded murals, and a diner called Maybell's with a chipped blue awning. A sign on the door read, "Now hiring, apply within." Inside, the place was a warm hug in the form of smells: bacon grease, maple syrup, and cinnamon toast. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with hoop earrings and a name tag that said Cheryl, eyed me like she could see right through me. "Where to eat or work?" she asked. I cleared my throat. "Work, if you're still hiring." She looked me up and down. "Have you ever waited tables?" "No," I admitted, "but I learned fast." She grunted. "Everyone says that." "Grab an apron from the back. You start now." Just like that, I became a waitress. I learned how to balance plates on my forearm, how to smile through back pain, how to keep the coffee full and the judgment low. I slipped into a rhythm: morning shifts, afternoon sketching at the park, night classes at the library's GED center. I lived on peanut butter sandwiches and tips tucked into my sock drawer. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. One evening, an older man sat at booth 3. He wore a plaid jacket and had the quiet look of someone who'd lost more than he let on. I brought him black coffee and a slice of peach pie without being asked. "You're not from here," he said. "No, sir," I replied, "just passing through." "Funny," he said, looking out the window. "So am I." He came back the next week, and the next. His name was Mr. Langston, and over time he told me bits and pieces. He'd once been in construction, had 2 knee surgeries, and now split his time between helping his niece and wandering wherever the wind pulled him. He noticed my sketchbook one night and asked to see it. I hesitated, but he just smiled like he had all the time in the world. After flipping through page after page, he looked up and said, "You've got something special. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." That simple sentence cracked something open inside me. Soon Mr. Langston started leaving me art supplies: pencils, charcoal, a tiny watercolor set. No note, just quiet gifts and softer smiles. Cheryl took notice, of course. "You've got a friend," she teased one morning as she topped off my coffee. "He's just kind," I said. She replied, walking off with a grin. Then one day, Mr. Langston didn't come in. Not that day or the next or the week after. I asked around, but no one had a number. He hadn't mentioned where he was headed, just vanished. At first I figured maybe that's what drifters do, come and go like the weather. But 3 weeks later, a certified letter arrived at the diner with my name on it. I stared at the envelope like it might bite me. It sat there on the break room table at Maybell's, stiff, official, my name typed neatly across the front. I touched it once, twice, then finally slid my finger beneath the flap. Inside was a letter on thick cream paper and a business card from a law firm in Louisville. My hands trembled as I read, Mr. Langston had passed. He'd left behind a small estate, no children, no surviving siblings, and had named me, of all people, in his will. The letter didn't say what I was receiving, only that I needed to appear in person. I blinked a few times, unsure if I was dreaming. I sat back in the wooden break room chair, the buzzing overhead light suddenly louder than it should have been. The idea that someone like him would think of someone like me, a waitress with thrift store shoes and a half-torn apron, was almost too much to believe. That evening, I found Cheryl restocking syrup containers near the diner's back pantry. I didn't even know his full name, I said quietly, holding up the letter. She turned, eyes wide. You mean Mr. Langston, the gentleman who came in on Tuesdays? I nodded. Apparently his name was Elias Langston, and he left me something. She smiled, the kind that makes you pause. Sometimes it doesn't take a lifetime to leave a mark on someone. Sometimes it just takes peach pie and kindness. A few days later, I stepped off a Greyhound bus in Louisville. I'd worn my cleanest jeans, a navy sweater, and boots that didn't quite match. The law firm's office was in one of those sleek high-rise buildings that made me feel like a speck. The receptionist smiled too politely, and the coffee in the waiting area was served in glass cups instead of paper. Everything around me smelled like lemon polish and expensive perfume. When they called my name, I followed a paralegal down a carpeted hall into a quiet room. A man in a navy suit greeted me. "Ms. Holloway," he said, "thank you for coming." I sat at the edge of my seat, clutching my purse like it was an anchor. "Mr. Langston didn't have a large estate," he continued gently, "but he did leave behind a one-bedroom cottage on the outskirts of town, and a studio space behind it used to be his workshop." My mouth opened, but no sound came. "He left me a house." "He left you a home," the lawyer corrected, sliding a folded letter across the table. "And this." I unfolded the note. The handwriting was old-fashioned and careful. "I once built homes for others. You're the first person who made me feel at home in years. Take this space. Fill it with beauty. You've got more talent than you realize. E. Langston." I pressed the letter to my chest. I wanted to cry, and I did, right there in front of a stranger in a pinstripe suit. When I returned to Madison, everything looked different. The familiar streets had a gentler glow. It wasn't the town that had changed, it was me. For the first time in years, I felt like something was beginning, not ending. The cottage sat at the far edge of town, nestled beneath tall pines, and flanked by a crumbling picket fence. It had moss on the roof, paint peeling around the windows, and a crooked mailbox with faded lettering. But it also had a porch swing, flower beds waiting for spring, and a quiet stillness that felt like peace. The studio in the back was a time capsule, sawdust on the floor, half-used paints in jars, and old sketches pinned to corkboards. I rolled up my sleeves and started scrubbing, sanding, patching, painting. It became my rhythm: work during the day, sketch by lamplight, eat soup from mismatched bowls. Cheryl came by with homemade curtains, and Amos, the carpenter who always tipped extra, fixed the broken porch railing in exchange for a charcoal drawing of his mother's old farmhouse. In the afternoons, I took long walks into town. I passed the post office where Mr. Langston had once held the door open for me, the grocery where he always offered to carry my bags, the benches where he used to sit and nod as people passed. I began to understand how much I'd taken for granted. I even started teaching watercolor basics on Saturdays at the community center. My students were seniors, some with walkers, some with hearing aids, but they came with open hearts and an eagerness that made every lesson feel like magic. They painted cardinals and barns and grandkids' faces and told stories while the paint dried. Every so often I'd pause and watch the light shift through the cottage windows. I'd never had a place that felt like mine, and now, somehow, I did. Then one evening, just as the sun slipped behind the hills, a car pulled up the gravel path. I was sweeping the porch, humming an old tune, when the door opened and a familiar voice sliced through the quiet. "Well," she said, stepping out in a soft pink coat, "you've certainly made do." It was Celeste. Her heels clicked against the stones, her lips painted just so, her gaze sweeping across the porch and garden with something between judgment and disbelief. My grip on the broom tightened, but I didn't speak. I just waited. By the time the frost clung to the corners of our windows and Christmas lights began twinkling down Main Street, I had almost adjusted to my new life at Maxine's place. Her quiet routines and soft-spoken kindness became a gentle rhythm I didn't know I craved. There was comfort in the mundane, morning coffee at her tiny kitchen table, the way she hummed to her old radio station, or how she insisted I always carry a scarf, just in case the wind turns nasty. But the holidays were coming, and with them came the ghosts of my old life. The town was buzzing about the annual Winterville Art Walk, a modest but beloved December tradition where local artists set up booths all around the square. I remembered walking past those tents as a kid, nose pressed to the cold glass of Mom's car window, wondering what it would be like to show my own work there. Maxine was the first to bring it up. "You should apply," she said casually one morning, buttering toast. "They're still accepting young artists." I called Jean, she runs the sign-ups. I nearly choked on my coffee. "Me? Exhibit my work?" "Maxine, I haven't painted anything finished in months." She gave me that look, half disbelief, half stern encouragement. "You've got a gift, Lacey. Hiding it in sketchbooks won't help anyone." Still, I hesitated. I hadn't even touched the art supplies I brought over in my duffel bag. They sat in Maxine's spare room like artifacts of a life I wasn't sure I could claim anymore. But later that day, I stood at the window watching fat snowflakes drift down on the sidewalk, and something stirred in me. Maybe it was the memory of Grandma Helen's hands guiding mine across a canvas. Maybe it was just the silence whispering that I had nothing left to lose. That night, I pulled out a canvas and started painting. It was slow at first. My strokes were hesitant, the images in my mind unclear. But once I started, it was like my heart remembered how to beat. Hours slipped by unnoticed. I painted until my fingers cramped, and the room smelled of turpentine and peppermint tea. Maxine would peek in every now and then, her face lighting up with quiet pride. "I think I'll call this one Resilience," I murmured one evening, brushing a last line of midnight blue across the skyline. Maxine smiled. "Good, because that's what you've got." Over the next few weeks, I completed 3 new pieces, each born from memory, grief, and hope. One depicted the silhouette of a girl standing alone beneath a snowfall, her breath fogging the air as stars blinked overhead. Another showed a worn kitchen table, 2 coffee mugs side by side, steam rising, an ode to Maxine's simple companionship. When I submitted my portfolio to the Art Walk committee, I didn't expect much. But a week later, I got an email. "Congratulations, Lacey Whitmore. Your work has been accepted." Maxine whooped so loud she scared the cat off the windowsill. We spent the next few days preparing. Maxine insisted on helping me frame each canvas, though her eyesight wasn't what it used to be. "I've been framing pictures since your mom was in diapers," she said, waving away my protests. The night before the event, nerves wrapped around my spine like ivy. "What if no one stops to look?" I asked Maxine while we packed the car with my art. "They will," she said firmly. "And even if they don't, this is still a victory. You're showing up. That's the bravest thing." The morning of the art walk dawned crisp and golden. I wrapped myself in Maxine's old wool coat and set up my booth just outside the post office. The town square was alive, vendors selling cider, carolers in scarves and mittens, kids throwing snowballs near the statue of Mayor Burnell. My paintings stood propped against the white tent walls like sentinels of my pain and perseverance. People trickled in slowly at first. A retired couple asked about the piece with the girl in the snow. A teenager lingered in front of Resilience, tracing the brushstrokes with her eyes. One man in a heavy flannel coat stopped, nodded once, and dropped a business card in my tip jar. And then, them. I spotted them across the street. My parents, Lydia, all 3, bundled in matching holiday sweaters, walking arm in arm toward the booths like nothing had ever happened. My stomach twisted. They hadn't spoken to me since the night they emptied my college fund and threw me out. My breath caught as they crossed the street, their eyes scanning the tents. I ducked slightly behind a hanging canvas, my hands trembling. "They're just people," I whispered to myself. "You don't owe them anything." But of course they found me. Of course, Lydia's gaze landed on my nameplate, Lacey Whitmore, featured artist, and her mouth curled. "Well, look who found a new hobby," she sneered, arms crossed. "Selling doodles at the farmer's market now." My mother pursed her lips, then reached out toward one of the canvases. "You always did like to draw. I suppose this one's quaint." My hands clenched around the edge of the table. Please don't touch the artwork, my father huffed. Is this what you're doing with yourself now, peddling paint like some street vendor? Maxine appeared beside me then, seemingly from nowhere, holding 2 cups of cider. Lacey's pieces are some of the most admired at the walk this year, she said, her voice calm but steel-lined. You should be proud. My parents blinked, startled. Lydia looked Maxine up and down with clear distaste. And who exactly are you? Maxine smiled coolly. Just someone who knows what real talent looks like. There was silence. For a moment, it felt like the snow had stopped midair. Then Lydia scoffed and turned to go. Let's not waste any more time. They walked away without another word, leaving nothing but a gust of perfume and resentment. Maxine handed me one of the ciders. You okay? I nodded, taking a slow sip. The apple and cinnamon burned sweet and hot down my throat. I think so. Actually, I think I'm better than I've been in years. That afternoon, someone bought Resilience. A stranger. He said it reminded him of his granddaughter, who'd just finished cancer treatment. He asked if I would consider doing a commission. As I watched him walk away, painting tucked under his arm, I realized something had shifted. I was done waiting to be seen by people who had chosen not to. I had finally learned to see myself. Maxine's porch smelled like cinnamon and freshly baked banana bread. She always baked on Saturdays, and I'd gotten used to the comforting scent sneaking out through her screen door like a secret. But that Saturday, as I stepped up with a trembling hand and tear-streaked cheeks, the smell felt almost too warm, too kind. I didn't feel like I deserved that kindness. She opened the door before I could knock, like she'd been waiting. Natalie, she said gently, stepping aside. Come in, sweetheart. I crossed the threshold without a word. My suitcase rolled behind me like a reluctant pet. Inside, her home was the same as always, knitted afghans over every couch arm, family photos in wooden frames, a kitchen full of life. But today it felt like a sanctuary. Sit, Maxine said, pointing to the small kitchen table. She poured me a mug of hot tea, the kind with spices that clung to your throat like a hug. I took a sip, and then everything collapsed. I started sobbing, full-bodied and raw. She didn't interrupt. She didn't ask. She just waited. When I could finally speak, I told her everything. The dinner, the announcement, the cold dismissal, the suitcase. My parents' eyes looked through me like I was wallpaper. Her hand rested over mine the entire time, warm and steady. I knew something was going on, she said, voice low. Your shoulders have been all curled in lately, like you're trying to disappear. I gave a humorless laugh. That's because I was. Well, not anymore. Her tone sharpened, the edge of her southern steel showing. You'll stay here, we'll figure things out. And honey, let's be clear, what they did to you was wrong. I nodded, swallowing another wave of grief. The following days at Maxine's were a blur of quiet healing. I slept a lot, read old books from her dusty shelves, helped her with morning crossword puzzles, and walked around the block in her oversized slippers. She didn't push me to talk unless I wanted to. That kind of patience, I didn't even know it existed. One night, curled under her knitted quilt, I admitted, I don't know what to do about college. That was all the money I had. Maxine didn't answer right away. She folded her newspaper and looked at me over her glasses. Well, she said, you remember Mr. Krause from the church? The one who always wears suspenders with little fish on them? She smiled. That's the one. He's the retired dean of admissions at Rockwell College, and he still volunteers with their scholarship foundation. Let's have coffee with him. I blinked. Wait, what? Why? Because I have a feeling he'd want to meet a girl like you. I didn't know what she meant exactly, but 2 days later, I found myself sitting across from Mr. Krause in the corner booth of Maggie's diner, hands folded tightly in my lap. Maxine had called ahead, and somehow the man had read my entire personal essay from my last college application. He had notes. You have a voice, he said, tapping the paper. You know what you want to say, and you say it plain. We like plains at Rockwell. I can't afford Rockwell. That's where scholarships come in, he replied, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Apply. Let us worry. That night, Maxine stayed up with me while I revised my essay and gathered my portfolio. Her old desktop hummed loudly, but it got the job done. At one point, she leaned over my shoulder and murmured, "Proud of you, baby girl." I almost cried again. The weeks passed, and I began to build something new. Maxine let me repaint the spare room into a soft sage green, helped me organize my paintings along the wall, and made sure I ate 3 meals a day. She even taught me how to make banana bread. "Just in case," she said, "you need to bribe someone with kindness." And then one evening, the letter arrived. I stood on her porch holding the envelope in both hands, like it might bite me. My name was typed in crisp black letters across the front. My knees buckled slightly as I opened it. "Dear Natalie," it began, "we are pleased to inform you—" I couldn't finish. My mouth was already open in a silent scream. Maxine was beside me in a flash. "You got in?" I nodded furiously, shoving the letter into her hands. She read quickly, then gasped. "And a full ride! Natalie, a full ride!" We jumped together like teenagers. Then she hugged me hard and whispered, "That's what happens when people see the real you." I believed her. I had no choice but to believe her. The celebration was short-lived, though. A few days later, my phone lit up with a text from my mom. Just one line. "We heard about the scholarship. Can we talk?" I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. Maxine, who had seen the message over my shoulder, said quietly, "You don't have to answer. Not until you're ready." And I wasn't, not yet. But I knew one thing. For the first time in my life, someone had seen me not as an afterthought, but as someone worth investing in. That mattered more than anything my parents could ever say. Maxine hummed to herself in the kitchen while I stared out the window, the letter still in my hand. The sun was setting behind the trees, painting the sky with gold and coral, and I wasn't invisible anymore. Thanksgiving morning arrived with the kind of crisp stillness that made the world feel both new and ancient. Maxine had been up since before dawn, humming hymns in the kitchen while the scent of roast turkey and nutmeg drifted through the house. I sat at the window with a mug of cider warming my hands, watching the neighborhood slowly wake up. It was the first Thanksgiving I could remember that didn't involve tense silences, fake smiles, or my sister Ella showing off a new handbag while Mom poured wine like it was holy water. This year, there was no assigned seating, no guilt tripping over pumpkin pie. Just me, Maxine, and a few of her friends from church who didn't have anywhere else to go. It felt peaceful. I had just set out the mismatched plates on the table when Maxine's phone rang. She answered with her usual cheer, but then her eyes flicked toward me and her smile faded just a hair. She handed me the phone. "It's your father." I didn't move. "Nat," she said gently, "it's okay if you don't want to. But if you do, I'll be right here." I took the phone. "Hello?" There was a pause, then his voice, cautious, softer than I had ever heard it. "Natalie, hi. I know it's been a while." 100 sharp retorts gathered on my tongue, but I swallowed them. "What do you want, Dad?" We heard you got into Rockwell. Full scholarship." He cleared his throat. "That's incredible." I said nothing. "We also heard you've been staying with that woman, Maxine." I bristled. "Her name is Maxine, and yes, I have. She's been more of a parent than you've ever been." He winced. I could hear it in his breath. "Natalie, we didn't mean for things to go the way they did. It got messy. Your mother, she thought helping Ella made sense at the time. We didn't realize how much we were hurting you." "That's because you weren't looking at me," he sighed. "We want to make it right. We'd like you to come home for dinner tonight, just to talk." I glanced at Maxine, who watched me calmly from the kitchen. "I'll think about it," I said, and hung up. Later that afternoon, I told Maxine everything. She wiped her hands on her apron and sat across from me. "You don't owe them anything, Natalie," she said gently. "But if you go, do it on your terms, no one else's." So I went. Not because I wanted their approval, but because I wanted to look them in the eye and say, finally, what had been lodged in my throat for years. The house looked the same, grand foyer, chandelier dimmed just so, everything styled for appearances. Ella abrió la puerta con un vestido de terciopelo, mirando sorprendida de ver que había llegado en realidad. "You look different," she said. I smiled. "I feel different." Dinner was tense. No one said much. My mother poured wine like old habits never die. My father kept glancing at me like he didn't know where to begin. Eventually, I did it for them. I got into Rockwell because I worked for it, I said, setting down my fork. Because someone believed in me, not because I smiled pretty for your friends or kept my head down while you threw money at Ella's problems. Natalie, my mother started, we were just trying to help her. And you sacrificed me to do it, I said calmly. But I'm not here for an apology. I came to say thank you for showing me exactly what kind of love I don't want in my life. They looked stunned. Ella blinked like I'd spoken in another language. I stood. I have to get back. Maxine's hosting a real Thanksgiving. No one followed me to the door. When I got home, Maxine was lighting the last candle on the table. She looked up and smiled like she'd been expecting me all along. Good timing. We were just about to carve the turkey. I slipped off my coat and joined them. People made room, passed dishes, poured cider. It was loud and a little chaotic and completely perfect. Later, after dessert, Maxine and I stood on the porch wrapped in quilts watching the stars. I told Mr. Krause you got in, she said. He cried. I chuckled. So did I. She squeezed my hand. You know, when I first saw you lugging that suitcase up my steps, I didn't just see a scared girl. I saw someone with fire. You didn't know it yet, but I did. I turned to her, eyes stinging. You saw me when my own family didn't. She nodded. And now the whole world will. I looked up at the night sky, stars blinking like little secrets. For the first time in my life, I felt full, not just from food or success, but from being known, truly known, by someone who didn't want anything in return. That's what unconditional love looks like, and sometimes it shows up wearing an apron and humming old church songs. I didn't expect the warmth of home to come from a stranger's kitchen, or that healing would arrive wrapped in the scent of cinnamon and old hymns. But sometimes the family we need finds us when we least expect it. Kindness, quiet and unassuming, has a way of rewriting stories that once felt carved in stone. Like a porch light left on in the dark, even a small act of love can guide someone back to themselves. If this story stirred something in you, maybe take a moment to look around. Someone nearby might be hoping to be seen. And remember, the heart rarely needs grand gestures. It just needs to be noticed.